So first of all, I would like to say that I'm honored to be part of this. And kudos to Mutare for their leadership position and for JSA for putting this on their behalf. I must admit, about 2 years ago, I did not know about Mutare, let alone be able to pronounce the name of the company. But now, fast forward 2 years later, they are a highly valued business partner, and we appreciate being part of this. So just to sort of frame this session and the sessions that preceded it, to a large extent, what we've been talking about is termination protection. In other words, what can we do from a terminating use case, meaning that a robotext or a robocall has come to a network and there's a possibility of being presented to a consumer, or most notably in the case of Mutare, an enterprise customer. I'm going to touch on some other areas though as well, including transit networks. So that would be network operators that take a call from point A and transport it to point B. And then, of course, there are call originators, because both good calls as well as problematic robocalls do originate from someplace. And so I'm going to be touching on some of those things. Another thing, just to sort of frame where we're at, to date, I would say that most of the time and effort and money as an industry is spent on protecting consumers, to a lesser extent, enterprise. Again, kudos to Mutare and what they do in that area. And so that would be things like awareness and education and things like don't answer your phone, which that's really not an option for enterprise. Enterprise has to answer their phones because they're in business to service their customers, especially if it's a consumer-facing business, you have to answer your phone. So I just wanted to state that, the fact that most of the effort and money and time is spent on that, to the exclusion of some other things that are very possible, such as blocking calls or redirecting calls or challenging calls, some of the technology and services that we work in partnership with Mutare. Another one that's really important to consider is deterrence. And so that would be things like stopping bad actors, removing them from networks, and even going so far as to prosecute them through litigation and maybe even criminal penalties so that they can't do the things that they're doing anymore. So I'm going to be touching on all of those things, and I think it's important to kind of lay that groundwork. So go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. And also, as a housekeeping matter, I'm going to go through the slides hopefully quickly enough that there will be some time at the end for Q&A. So what I've asked JSA to do is to capture those questions, any that they may have already and that may come up as I'm proceeding through this deck, and to have a Q&A session at the end to answer any of your questions. So this slide here just provides you a little bit of context about YouMail and what we do. And again, it touches on what I mentioned a little while ago. There's bad actors. They originate their calls either on domestic networks or on international gateways. Those calls through least cost routing with voice over internet protocol are routed through one or more networks typically before they get to terminating networks, and then ultimately get to consumers or to an enterprise user. So go ahead and advance the slide. So this next slide is just a little bit of a perspective into some of the things that can be done from a monitoring perspective, and that's what I'm going to be spending a lot of my time on with this presentation. Is I'm not going to be talking about call labeling. I'm not going to be talking quite so much about things like stir shaken, and I'm not going to be talking as much about know your customer, KYC, which is a very important topic. We could spend a whole session or even a whole day talking about those. I'm going to be spending most of the time on monitoring. And this is just an exemplary snapshot of what a dashboard could look like if you're monitoring behavior that's happening in telecommunications networks. In this case, the brand per se is the Social Security Administration, SSA. And so we look at things like, what are the traffic patterns? Where are we seeing most of the calls originated? Where are most of the calls terminated? What is the volume of calls by campaign? And by campaign, our definition is, what is the robocaller saying? Because we're focused on content-based analytics. And I'm going to talk about that some more in just a few minutes so that you understand what I mean by content-based analytics versus event-based analytics. So what you see here is a snapshot from a web-based dashboard. that could give a business partner some visibility into what is going on with their network and or what is going on with telephone numbers of interest. And typically that would be numbers that either they own and or control on behalf of somebody else. Let's go ahead and advance the slide. Next one too. So there's many types of robocalls, but if we were to characterize them in just broad strokes, you could say that one type is outright scams. That would be somebody that is not selling an actual product. Instead, they just seek to derive something of monetary value from you and or capture your identity for nefarious purposes. That would be an outright scam. The other type of unwanted robocall, particularly egregious unwanted robocall, is unlawful telemarketing. And so that would be something like car warranties, where they actually are selling a car warranty. However, they're using deceptive telemarketing tactics and in some cases even outright unlawful. And we're going to look at the anatomy of an unlawful call here on the next slide. So let's proceed. So 3 dimensions that are really important to consider is not only spam, but also unlawfulness, which consists of, is it outright fraud, but also other illegal aspects. So if something is fraudulent, and this is taking things from a YouMail context, we do not actually listen in on live calls. And I'm going to talk in just a minute what we do because I think it's important to understand what can be done. It's not intended to be an advertisement for YouMail. It's more intended to be educational so that you understand what can be done. You don't have to listen into a live call to know if fraud is occurring. Obviously, fraud happens after people answer, and that's how people lose money and their identity. But fraud could also be something like someone claiming to be with Microsoft. And that could either be explicit, where somebody says, I'm calling from Microsoft, but it's really not, or it could be implicit, where they refer to Microsoft as if they know that you have a Microsoft account or they have some relationship with Microsoft. That would be an example of fraud and one type of unlawful activity. Another type of unlawful activity would be things like violating the Federal Trade Commission's telemarketing sales rule. And for those of you that are not familiar with it, I encourage you to look it up. It says things like an enterprise must self-identify themselves on the pre-recorded audio that they use in conjunction with robocalls. And they must also provide a valid callback number. In one of the earlier sessions, I think somebody was talking about use of a direct telephone number, and it turns out it wasn't a valid telephone number. So one of the things that we do when we curate these calls is we verify that it's actually a valid telephone number. It's not just some random number. And of course, they must call and say, for example, I'm calling from Ford Motor Company about your car warranty. I'm not just Gerry Christensen calling about your car warranty. The latter would be a violation of the FTC's telemarketing sales rule, TSR. And then finally, spam. And so obviously, if something is unlawful or outright fraudulent, it's also very spammy, but it could be considered spammy for other reasons. This is the hardest category for the YouMails of the world to deal with because it's highly subjective. I would argue that any analytics engine, including those others that are represented as also being business partners with Mutare and others that are not part of this Vishing Awareness Week, it's a struggle because it's largely based on crowdsourced feedback and also some heuristics. Does something look spammy, perhaps because of the number of calls that they've made, or maybe the calling pattern based on the area code and the next 3 digits, the MPA and XX of where they're calling from and who they're calling to. So it's a struggle, but the first 2 is very black and white, at least when it comes to YouMail anyway, and content-based analytics, because if we see the transcript from the actual audio, like what I've depicted here, this is from an actual call that you see here, we can see that this is definitely unlawful, and on the basis of that, take some actions, such as informing communication service providers to block calls like that and not allow them to transfer across the network. Let's proceed to the next slide. Another very specific form of unlawfulness is brand impersonation, and this is an actual example. We couldn't click on this to listen to it, although if you go to YouMail, you could do that, or you could go to YouTube and find it. This is just illustrative for this discussion. But the transcript is here. It goes something like this. Somebody says that they're calling from Georgia Power, and they literally say they're going to disconnect your service. Again, education awareness is very important to let people know that a utility will never do that. Not only will they not call you to tell that, but they won't threaten you like that. In this case, it's fraud because they're claiming to be Georgia Power, but they're really not. And one of the things that can happen is if you're working with a YouMail type service, you can track down who the bad actor is, remove them from the network, and provide deterrence to keep them from doing that in the future. Let's go ahead and advance to the next slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges with identifying and detecting and dealing with unwanted robocalls. STIR/SHAKEN is a perfect example. It catches some, but not all spoofing. And of course, spoofing is use of a telephone number by somebody in some way that is typically not authorized. Many people don't realize that spoofing itself is not illegal, but it's only when it's used without authorization and or with ill intent that it's illegal. STIR/SHAKEN stops some of that. For example, I'm a Verizon user, and a Verizon number can't be spoofed to call me anymore. I once had my own number call me, perfect example. That sort of thing doesn't happen anymore. Go ahead and advance the slide. So some important concepts here is for safe communication, you really need to have some form of authentication and validation, such as STIR/SHAKEN. You need to have know your customer in place, good methods and procedures to deal with that, and you need to have some form of behavioral monitoring. We see all the time on the YouMail network B and even A attested calls that are unlawful. And what that means is if it's an A attested call, you know the network and you can attribute the phone number to the network. A B attested call means you know the network, but you can't attribute the telephone number as being associated with the network. So in the case of A, that's pretty egregious because what that's basically saying is that somebody that signed that call is saying that they know the network and they know the number, but yet it's still unlawful. And so that's one of the reasons why it's important to also monitor. On the right-hand side, we talk about intent of call. With event-based analytics, it's problematic. Event-based analytics being things like counting the number of SIP messages, the number of call origination attempts, or looking at things like velocity or frequency, things like could a human being place 20 calls a second. Those are more or less heuristics. There are some deterministic things you can do, like look at the number to see, is it a do not originate number, a DNO number? DNO numbers, by definition, do not originate calls. They're only used for terminating. They're only used to be called and not to make calls. So that's a deterministic way of using event-based analytics to stop unwanted robocalls. But that is largely the exception to the rule because most of the calls that are placed are not from DNO numbers. There's a lot of them, granted, but most of them are not DNO. So you really need to have some behavioral-based way to determine whether it's illegal or not. And that's where content-based analytics comes into play. Let's proceed to the next slide. So an important way to view the world, we mentioned Venn diagrams earlier in this day. Here's another Venn diagram. So STIR/SHAKEN being an example of authentication, validation, know your customer, KYC, and then monitoring. So for each of these respectively, you can see here what's represented as the value for each one of them taken alone as a silo. But I would argue that bringing those three together and having a solid solution for all three is extremely important. Let's advance to the next slide. And so one of the reasons why it's important is, for example, look at where KYC and monitoring crosses over. You cannot know your customer's customers. And so that, I mean, by that statement, I mean that, for example, if you are the owner of a telephone number, you are the authorized entity that has the right to use a telephone number, and let's say somebody else borrows that or leases it from you, you might know from a KYC perspective who they are and how to reach them, but you don't know with 100% assurance what they're going to do with that number once they lease it from you. They could conceivably be doing something illegal with it, and again, YouMail sees those kind of things all the time. So this is why I say that it's really important for safe communications to have a solid foundation for each one of these three. And it's really where all three of them overlap with one another, the sweet spot where things happen. Let's go ahead and advance. So here's an example of event-based analytics versus content-based analytics. So event-based would be like a SIP message. And here's a sort of a contrived example of a SIP message. This is not a real one, but it's some of the same format that's used. not necessarily for a call, but for some kind of communications. There's a much higher false positive rate on this. Some of the previous speakers spoke about this. I think it was actually Liz, my colleague, that mentioned earlier that there is a fair number, quite a bit actually, of false positives from a labeling perspective, where some of the other analytics engines might say scam likely or spam likely, and it turns out it's actually a legitimate enterprise call. That is an unfortunate consequence of what I refer to as the one and done phenomenon, where literally some phone numbers are used only one time, and then the actor, oftentimes a bad actor, will place another call with a completely different telephone number. So it's really difficult to deal with that, and so an unintended consequence is a lot of call labeling that happens. Compare and contrast that to the content-based analytics, where you're actually looking at the call payload, has a very high efficacy, because what you're looking at is the actual content of the call in the form of the pre-recorded audio that's left behind by the robocaller. It has a very low false positive rate when it comes to claiming the call as being associated with unlawful activity, because we can see the actual intent of the call based on what they're saying. Let's go ahead and proceed. So this is an eye chart, and I'm not going to try to go through this in the next 7 minutes because it would be prohibitively difficult. This is all covered by YouMail patents, so I'm not really concerned about trade secrets and things like this, but this is a rough approximation of what we do at YouMail and what can be done to identify not only unwanted robocalls, but in particular the unlawful variety. And so, but I'll just hit the high level, and that is you capture audio on what we call a sensor network. That is our app users that have downloaded our app. You identify using AI and machine learning first whether something is a robocall, because you don't want to be listening in or getting a transcript of someone's private message, like my wife saying, pay the credit card bill before it's overdue. So once you identify that something's a robocall, because, for example, you see that there's 150 million of them that all look exactly the same, then you can curate and augment with human intelligence, and that's what we do, where you can curate it by saying what type it is. It's an SSA scam, for example, like I mentioned earlier. Is it something that is subject to blocking, meaning that it's unlawful to the extent that it should be blocked if it can be? Or is it just something that's spammy and problematic that you might want to challenge? So that's the most that I'm going to go through this slide. Suffice to say, there's a lot of things that go into making this happen. So let's go ahead and advance the slide. So now we're going to talk about stopping unwanted robocalls. How do we do this? So in this slide here, this is some of the technological approach that we use with our partner, Mutare. What we do is we first identify the problematic robocalls, and in particular, the ones that are really concerning, and especially those that are unlawful. We want to, in some cases, challenge them. Maybe that's a CAPTCHA, maybe that's a redirect, you send them to an IVR, but maybe sometimes you actually block them. And the way that we do that is simply by labeling data, and that data is used either within a session border controller or a soft switch, or if it's a terminating use case to enterprise, it could be some kind of IP proxy that is used to screen the call. And that it's really just as simple as that. The very last bullet point, SIP-based query response, that would be more from a communication service provider, and that could be used for every call to stop not only on the terminating side, but also on the originating side or the transit side to stop these calls from going through your network. Let's go ahead and advance. So here, what we're talking about is something that's referred to as a traceback, and this is something that YouMail does all the time. And something that is perhaps an interesting data point for you is that some of these high-profile cases that you've heard where a bad actor has been brought to justice, in many cases, probably most cases, that was based on YouMail data. What we do is we work with the industry traceback group, the ITG, to provide evidential proof of wrongdoing. That is used to trace back in the IP network as far as you can go to the point of origin, which could be either a domestic originator or it could be an international gateway, with the intent to inform that communication service provider of what's happened and tell them that they need to remove that customer. And so that happens with a very high efficacy rate, meaning that if somebody uses a service associated with this, the bad actor will be removed. And in the example that's given here, Social Security Administration, they'll stop doing that, saying that. A commercial example is one of our customers that I can talk about is Marriott. They used us to stop bad actors from saying, this is Marriott calling about your timeshare. One of the challenges with this, though, I must say, though, is that the bad actors are highly nomadic. They typically deal with LLCs, and because Know Your Customer KYC is weak across different call originators, they'll follow the path of least resistance. They'll get called on one network and then they'll go to another. So that's why I refer to as deterrence rather than stopping them. Stopping is a one-time event. Deterrence is an ongoing process and procedure. And that's what we do, because we will usually we'll see a spike on a campaign. You know, somebody saying something about Marriott, we'll shut them down, we'll get rid of them. And then maybe a few weeks or months later, we'll see another spike, we'll shut them down, and then it'll trail off significantly because the bad actor becomes informed that their calls aren't being answered because they're simply not going through. Next slide. So one of the things that we also do is we partner with communication service providers for something that we refer to as fast lanes. And so we do this not to the exclusion of what we do with ITG, but actually as a really good complement to it, where if we have a relationship with a carrier, we can inform them, hey, we've seen some unlawful traffic happening on your network. Go ahead and shut that down because you don't want it, the government doesn't want it, enterprise doesn't want it, let's just shut it down. And that's highly effective. Again, not to the exclusion of what we do with the ITG, they're also a valued partner. So I left 2 minutes for Q&A. I hope there is some. I know I kind of shot you with a fire hose there. Hopefully I didn't talk too fast, and let's see what questions we might have.
Okay, I do have one, at least one. It says, how can businesses work with service providers and industry groups to develop collaborative solutions that protect both their brand and their customers?
Really good question, really open-ended question. So I guess I'll give an open-ended answer. I could try to dive into some specifics on what time I've got. So I think the key point there is it is really all about collaboration. I would say table stakes is education and awareness. Next step would be to identify what can you do as an enterprise to actually mitigate these types of calls. And mitigate can take many forms. I mentioned some of them earlier. It could be what sort of solutions could you put in place to have a challenge so that the calls never actually ring at your enterprise. And those things could be causing the calls to go to an interactive voice response system, an IVR, because the bad actor robocallers, they're not going to go any further. They're just going to hang up. So looking at things like that, looking at solutions such as can we actually block those calls before they even arrive. But then also I would say that in addition, looking beyond the terminating use case is stopping abuse of your own brand. Many enterprises are not aware just how bad it is in terms of brands being abused by bad actors that are imposters. I mentioned one of them earlier, Marriott, and I gave the utility example. YouMail conducted a survey recently, and I don't want to steal the thunder because we're going to be doing an announcement on that. But it was interesting. The findings were that the predominant types of brands that were abused are package delivery companies like UPS, FedEx, IDH, et cetera, and financial services, so that would be primarily banks. And so something that should be considered there is what kind of a solution could you acquire to stop your brand from being sullied, to stop bad actors from saying that they are your brand, but they're really not, because that has a very bad effect on your customers. And with that, I think I'm out of time unless we're able to go over a little bit.
Yeah, you can go over a little bit, and we do have one other question, at least. So that is, okay. Are we any closer yet to a real proactive or even reactive measure for when we are the entity being impersonated to help protect our clients or members as a business?
Not sure I caught that last part. Are we any, say it again, please.
Yeah, sure. So, okay, are we any closer yet to a real proactive or even a reactive measure for when we are the entity being impersonated to help protect our clients or members as a business? Gotcha.
I think that question may have crossed paths while I was giving the answer I just gave. Yes, definitely both, actually. What I said just a moment ago was reactive, and that would be, let's say you're a Marriott, and this is exactly what Marriott did. Their brand was being abused. They came to us, they said, hey, YouMail, fix this. We monitored to see how many campaigns were out there involving their brand. We worked with them very closely to be absolutely sure a campaign that we thought was fraudulent actually was, because if you're working for a bank, for example, you don't want to assume something's fraudulent when you find out it's actually the brand themselves that really is offering a lower interest rate. So sometimes you need to do some vetting. And on that particular service, it is reactive in the sense that they came to us and then we acted on that. But there's some proactive measures that you can take as well. One of those is just simply registering your telephone numbers. I would suggest that every enterprise that has telephone numbers that they care about, whether they're do not originate numbers or whatever type of numbers they are, register them with a YouMail type service, because what we would do is monitor them and let you know if they're being spoofed. As a point of information, typically the brand impersonation does not involve number spoofing. Typically they're just random numbers because the bad actors don't go to that much trouble. When they do go to that much trouble, it's particularly egregious. If they're spoofing your number, because it might even show up in the calling name with your enterprise name on it, that would be really dangerous. But minimally, though, you want to at least have your numbers monitored to see if they're spoofed, see if the reputation is, see if there's any reason why you might have poor call answer rates. So that would be a proactive measure that you could take. So hopefully that answers the person's question well.
Yeah, and one more. I think this will be our last question. I work in customer support, so I have to answer every call to be helpful. What advice would you have to protect myself against?
Well, if you're in customer support, it's highly likely that if you get one of these types of robocalls, as soon as they realize what your function is, they're probably going to hang up. Because number one, if you're in customer support, you're probably more savvy than sadly some of these headlines that we hear about elderly people losing their life savings, number one. And then number two, probably the best thing you can do is if you have any questions at all, put them on hold. Talk to your supervisor, do whatever you need to do. I know you've got metrics that you have to uphold on your inbound calls. You're supposed to handle them, but it's probably better to be on the safe side. I know I'm editorializing. This is the Gerry answer, not the YouMail answer. But I would say just be careful, especially as some of these things get more sophisticated. We talked about generative AI and voice cloning and things like that. Things will get more sophisticated. So a situation like that, when it comes to your enterprise and giving up trade secrets or things that could be a problem, err on the side of caution, I would say.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It was really filled with a lot of interesting information, very helpful. I appreciate you sharing that with us and supporting Vishing Awareness Week.
Thank you.